Well, hey, everybody. Welcome. My name's Dave. And if we haven't met, I'm going to introduce you to a couple folks. We're going to get into a discussion today, but first I want to introduce our panel. On my left here, from Portland, Oregon, home of the Blazers, Joshua Ryan Butler. He's a pastor at Imago Dei Church. He's also the author of a couple books, Pursuing God and The Skeletons in God's Closet. You've been here before. You've spoken. You've done labs with us, so you're an old friend of Westgate. Liz Ditty, who's on our teaching team and also you're also an author. You just turned in your manuscript.
I did, yes.
Yes, that's exciting. When's the publish date?
It'll release October 2018.
Woohoo! And what's the name of the book?
Thanks for the free commercial.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's God's Many Voices.
Oh, very cool.
Learning to listen, expectant to hear.
Nice. And that's by Liz Ditty. And then over there, all the way over there, is Jay Kim. Jay and I used to share an office, but now you work with. Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Short-lived.
Awesome.
Now you're at Vintage Faith, and you're also part of the leadership team at Regen.
Yeah, Regeneration Project.
Regeneration Pod. And then also they have a podcast too.
Yes.
Pretty cool. And if you don't know what that is, you should download it because it's amazing. We're going to get into Exodus 6 through 12, in which we have a really difficult question come up. And almost everybody who reads through the book of Exodus kind of stops at this point because this is a really troubling part of Scripture. It's this part where it says that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And so for a lot of folks, they read these passages and they think, like, oh my gosh, does this mean that God did this, that he hardened Pharaoh's heart? What does that mean? Does that mean that he can interfere with free will? Is he going to do that to me? Can he do that to a loved one? Is he doing that to me right now? Does he write evil? Like, what happens if I want God and he hardens my heart or rejects me? All these kind of questions get stirred up. Have you guys kind of encountered that in your life? Have you seen people kind of come to this passage and stop dead on and be like confused?
Well, I was reading through the Bible with a group of people, and it's funny, you come to these stories that you sort of remember from Sunday school, and they're sort of like the common stories that we all agree on. Like we know that, Moses said, let my people go, and there were plagues, and Israel went to the desert. And then you read it as an adult, and you're thinking, wait a minute. Wait, when I read this actually in the Bible, it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart.
Right.
And they're reading how horrible all these plagues are. And you're like, wait, and you're picturing yourself like in Egypt under the scorching sun, and God is hardening Pharaoh's heart and you're suffering for it. And you're just not even sure who God is in this story, and it doesn't seem like the God that we all know and love, and it's confusing, and we're also like not really sure if we're allowed to be confused about that.
Right.
We're sort of supposed to say, well, I mean, it's the Bible, it all works out, but there's like some really deep questions there that doesn't always feel like we have a safe place to explore.
Right. So let's just jump in. Like, what are we to make of this difficult phrase that God hardened Pharaoh's heart? What can the story show us, and how do we get into that?
Yeah. I think that line, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, is so jarring. I mean, even when I hear you say the words just right now, it's such a jarring, shocking line because it puts into question everything that we've sort of been taught about God and about us as human beings, and the ability to make choices, to choose God, and all these things. And we read a line like that, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and like Liz was saying, we're just like, as adults, we're like, wait a minute, this isn't the neat, nicely bow-tied children's story that I'm used to, where God is like the good guy and the people aren't the good guys, and then there's a bad guy, because we read something like this, wait, like, is Pharaoh really the bad guy? Because it says God hardened his heart. And, we'll get into this, I'm sure, as we discuss further. There's so much to it that's really rich and leads us to a really hopeful picture of not only who God is, but what he's up to in the world. But I guess the first thing I would say is, and I think this will come up as a theme throughout our conversation, but it's so important to read the scriptures, to read them as scripture and like as a story, an unfolding story that has many parts to it. So the first thing I think for me is, and we've all talked about this, when you read the text, the story in its entirety, what you see is that certainly God does harden Pharaoh's heart. That's in the text. But we also see multiple times, not only does it say that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, but it also says that Pharaoh hardens his own heart. In chapter 7, God speaks to Moses, and he just simply says, Pharaoh's heart is hardened, right? So there seems to be this interplay of it's not the picture of a sort of puppet on a string, and God is the puppet master,
right.
and Pharaoh is just this puppet with no human agency. He just happens to be this sort of a victim that's there, and God's like hardening of his heart is just a weight he has to bear. That's not how the story unfolds. Pharaoh is certainly intricately involved, as is God in some ways. So I think that's the first thing I would say, is that there is an interplay here, that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, but Pharaoh himself is also hardened.
Yeah, as you read 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, it's like, at first it's like Pharaoh hardens his heart, then his heart is hardened. It's kind of this weird passive, and then it goes back to Pharaoh hardened his heart, and then his heart is hardened. Mm-hmm. Then Pharaoh hardened his heart. Then the last three, it's God hardened, God hardened, God hardened. Yeah. It's almost as if Pharaoh kind of reached a point of no return or something, and that God gave him what he wanted.
Yeah, there's really that interesting emphasis, like early in the plagues, this emphasis on Pharaoh hardening his heart, and then as you get towards the end, this emphasis on God hardening his heart. And one of the ways I think of it too is that I think God saying, "Let my people go," is how he hardens Pharaoh's heart. And let me explain what I mean by that. If you think about, like, with my kids, I've got 3 kids, and if I go to my son, and my son kind of like sneaks a cookie from the cookie jar, kind of thieves it, steals it out, and he's kind of over with it. And if I come to my son, I'm like, "Hey, let the cookie go," and he's like, "No, and so maybe I raise my voice a little louder. "No, let the cookie go." And almost like my confronting him with let the cookie go makes him even more so kind of come in, and I go, "No, let the cookie go." If I raise my voice even more, and it causes him to almost curve in more, my confrontation of what he's doing is causing him, it's revealing what's going on in his heart, what he wants. Cookie. Exactly, and it's causing him to kind of curve in on himself against me. And so I think there's something similar going on in the story. Classically, like Augustine, one of the great historical theologians of the church, he talked about this. He talked about how there's kind of an internal and external dynamic he saw happening with Pharaoh here. The internal dynamic going internally from the inside out, like, we're responsible for what we love, what we desire, our affections. Like, Pharaoh wants his pride and his rebellion against God, and that's his evil. He's responsible for that. The internal disposition of his heart is Pharaoh's to own. And yet God, in his kind of sovereign, providential order of creation, that God is responsible for the external circumstances that can incite or reveal what's in his heart, right? And so he would kind of go, Pharaoh's hardening of his heart is kind of like the kid going, "I want the cookie," and God's hardening is sort of that let my people go, the external circumstance, the confrontation that incites what's going on in his heart and reveals, he kind of becomes hardened under the circumstance of that confrontation.
Because Pharaoh, go ahead.
But if Pharaoh, his heart is already curling up in himself and has hardened himself already 6 times or something, then why does God even have to harden his heart if he's already hard?
Yeah, well, and I think the idea would be sort of that, like, God's confrontation itself is it's the, and we'll get more into, I think, some of the other allusions here in a second, but I do think there's this picture that God's confrontation of Pharaoh is God's hardening of Pharaoh. It's revealing the internal disposition of his heart towards evil.
Well, it's also, they're mutually exclusive things. Like, Pharaoh wants the Israelites for his personal slave force for economic reasons, and God views them as children, and to be free, and they're mutually exclusive. So it's like, you can't keep the cookie, and also eat the broccoli or be healthy, So they're mutually exclusive, right?
So are you saying, Joshua, it's not when God hardens Pharaoh's heart, it's not like he takes his icy finger and, like, Elsa or whatever freezes his heart.
And that is our first Frozen reference. It's our first one of many to come. Because love is an open door.
I have kids too. But you're saying that it's not like God is freezing his heart or hardening his heart. It's God being who he is and asking him to do what he's doing is causing Pharaoh's heart which is already disposed a certain way, to actually harden itself.
Exactly. Like, there's this, the caricature would be, I think a false picture would be one where Pharaoh's kind of like, God, I want you. And God's like, well, too bad. I need a tool for evil. So ice skaters, I'm going to make you bad. Like that would be a false picture, right? Like I think the real picture is one where, Pharaoh views the Israel, he views the people as widgets, right? Like for his own personal use. God views them as his children. And there's a mutual incompatibility like between those two. Are they widgets? Are they Pharaoh's widgets or are they God's kids, right? And there's a confrontation, and the confrontation is revealing like Pharaoh's unwillingness to let them go is his hardening. Like you see him getting more and more, where his own advisors are going like, you're going crazy, you're insane. Like there's a sense of his vice is curving him in on himself, and God's confrontation is inciting that vice to be exposed fully.
That line, God hardening Pharaoh's heart, as a snapshot is really disturbing. But when we take sort of a step back, to me, what's really hopeful about it is, you think about the story being told. It's actually told from the perspective of the underbelly of oppression. This is a story of the Jewish people who have been enslaved for centuries, awaiting hope and rescue, right? That's the original context for the storytelling that's unfolding here. And what's really hopeful about it is that even in the midst of this evil, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but this evil empire that has oppressed their people, God's people, for so long, it's not that God is powerless or void from the situation. That even in the process of Pharaoh, who represents this empire, coming to terms with what God is up to, God's plan for his people, God is involved even in the midst of Pharaoh's choice to have a hardened heart, a hardened inward posture toward God. And to me personally and pastorally, it's so important because it means that God is still involved. It means that God is still close and that he sees, like in Romans, Paul writes about all these evil, people who are making these godless choices in their lives. And then it says, therefore God gave them over, right? There's a participatory nature where God is involved. And in 1 Timothy, he's writing to Timothy about all these godless people who are leading people astray. And he says that they're involved with demons, and he says they're hypocritical liars. And then the text tells us that their consciences have been seared. Like something, heat searing something in, like, okay, there's a permanence now based on the choices you have made. And I sort of see God hardening Pharaoh's heart, just like you're saying, as the end, sort of natural, logical end of God participating in human agency. People make choices, and those choices lead us to a certain place.
That's really uncomfortable because it means that we can kind of, as humans, reach a point of no return. And we can keep going down. Our trajectory can get so far that is that what that means? That we can actually make those, this thing with God is actually more fluid and dynamic than we'd like, that we have an agency in it. We can actually get so far that we sear ourselves.
Well, I do think there's this sobering reality, going like, do not harden yourself against God. Don't harden your heart against God, because you might not be able to come back, from the brink, so to speak. Because I think of I've talked to some people who will be like, well, dude, I'm gonna follow God 10, 20 years from now, but I just want to get my juices out today, like go out and have fun and just do my thing, and I kind of go, dude, that's a facade, because you're becoming the kind of person that you're gonna be, and if you're giving yourself to, I'm going to harden my heart from God, but I'll be soft towards in the future. Like, no, there's a trajectory of you, almost like an addiction. Like you get more and more immersed and wrapped up in that posture, and it's not to say that God's not big enough and there's grace and desire, but it's dangerous ground to walk on. To go, I'm gonna live for myself today and just come back down. It reveals like you don't see God as life and freedom today.
Let's talk a little bit about what you hinted at, which was the idea of that this is also a big story historically, that there's some historical understandings, and being distant from it, not being the Hebrew people, we lose some stuff. Let's talk a little bit about the idea that Pharaoh is actually the oppressor, and what this story reveals about that, and why the idea that God hardens Pharaoh's heart could actually be viewed by the Israelites and the Hebrews as really good news. Let's talk about that.
Well, one thing I think is really interesting is we don't get Pharaoh's name, right? He
Right.
doesn't go like, "Hey, this is Pharaoh Joe or Pharaoh
Yeah,
Bill,"
Pharaoh is
you
not
know,
a
or
name.
yeah,
People
totally.
don't- no, some people might
It was
think
like
Pharaoh's
president.
a name.
It's like,
Yeah, right.
oh, God hardened president's heart. Is it like a title
Right.
or you know, God hardened CEO, or like it's a title rather than a personal name. We don't get that this was Thutmose or Ramses or one of the Egyptian pharaohs. And I think that's significant. Going, it's a representation of the office, and the pharaoh at that time was seen not as just like this lone dude, like solo individual by himself. He was the representative for his people. He represented the social body of Egypt as a whole. So I think there's a context here in the ancient worldview that like this isn't just God dealing with lone dude. This is God dealing with Egypt has hardened itself against God for centuries.
So it's a societal kind of figurehead.
Exactly, societal figurehead. So what God's doing to Pharaoh is really, it's God engaging with the oppressive empire as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting in the way that the story is told. I find myself empathizing so much with Pharaoh and with the Egyptians. And you kind of like, if you don't step back and say, no, remember, this is the Pharaoh who every boy that was born, as they came out, he told the midwives, as a newborn baby comes out of its mother, you're supposed to kill it.
Right.
Like every boy born to every woman was murdered
Right.
for years.
So this is an oppressive empire.
And
Right.
yeah, the slavery, the oppression, the violence is really real. And I think sometimes we think, I don't know why, the way that the narrative is told or the way that I expect the narrative to read or the stories that I'm used to or the mindset that I have, I just sort of assume that Pharaoh's like kind of a good guy, but you know, I mean, who's going to let his whole empire go? Like no person in power is going to say, yes, you can have my entire slave force, you know, but like, and we sort of miss that actually there is deeply rooted historical evil and oppression that we just don't really recognize being represented.
Yeah, the storytelling is really important, I think, in that, you know, the name, the personal name of the Pharaoh is left out. And it seems fairly clear, I think, that certainly Pharaoh was a real person,
Right.
but that as the story unfolds, the purpose of the story is that Pharaoh represents, like you're both saying, the system of evil that has oppressed God's people for hundreds of years. And so what that then means is that as God confronts Pharaoh in the text, God is not confronting, you know, again, like the Elsa, like God's mighty finger into one little person's heart, I'm going to make it cold and, you know, punish you. No, God's confrontation is not just to Pharaoh Bob or whatever his name may have been. God is confronting the entire system of evil that is oppressed and killed, you know.
Many people.
Yeah,
Right.
many
Yeah.
people, his people.
And we only have to read, like you alluded earlier, a few verses before
yeah.
to hear that God's people are crying out in pain against this injustice.
They've been crying out for a long time. This is what we often forget when we read in snapshots, right? It's like, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Oh man, that's messed up, God. This is God hardening the evil empire that has oppressed his people for hundreds of years.
Right.
God has heard their cry. And in chapter 34 of the same story, God's like, I'm slow to anger. And when we read it in that context, we're like, God, you really are slow to anger.
Right.
And yeah, and I really think that this angle, like you really start to see that this is a story of hope for the world, that we have a God who will ultimately deal with systemic and structural evil in our world. You know, that I think it's good news that I think you see this picture where God is patient with our world, and it's good that God's patient. You know, God is patient for hundreds of years with Egypt as it hardens itself against him and gets more and more oppressive and destructive. And God's patient with me today when I'm living in ways and I need that patience. You know, it's a chance to turn to him and be transformed by his goodness. But we also see that though God is patient, his patience will not last forever, right? And that's also good news because it means, there's a time coming when God is going to set things right, when the last will become first and the first will become last, and Jesus' great reversal sets his world straight again, and that's hope. And I think it's particularly hope for the oppressed of the world. You know, I get to travel and work internationally with a lot of folks, both the global church and people and just folks in different parts of the world who have the boot of power on their neck and the boot of histories and legacies of injustice in ways that are just crushing. And I believe God's people are crying out from around the world today, and there's the hope, the good news that God's patient, but the hope and the good news that God's patience will not last forever. Like he will come.
So this is actually good news for the Israelites, because they basically are saying this Yahweh is bigger than the Pharaoh God. Mm-hmm. And the Pharaoh has been the God. He's proclaimed himself as God. He's done everything evil to them. And suddenly there's a Yahweh who's actually bigger than this Pharaoh, the biggest God that they've ever seen. And so it builds trust that this Yahweh is good and will rescue them. So in some ways, it's good news.
Well, and I think we see the problem in the Psalms and all throughout Israel's history. When it looks like evil is winning, it's really confusing because evil's winning. So does that mean that God isn't stronger? Or does it mean he's just gone? Or does it mean he doesn't care? And here we have this fourth option.
Right.
That actually he does hear the cries, that actually he's patient, and that one day judgment will come and things will be set right.
Yeah.
Right. There's also, this story isn't just in Exodus. This story is part of a story. It's part of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, the people of God and their story. So we're still kind of early in the story. So how does this story fit into the rest of the biblical narrative? And what can the rest of the biblical narrative show us about this story that perhaps if we just kind of, like you said, just snapshot it out, we miss?
Yeah, well, I would say, Pharaoh is part of this bigger story. And one of the things that's really interesting in the text is that we read the word hardened. There's actually 3 different Hebrew words that get translated as hardened into English, right? And each of these 3 words has different kind of allusions or echoes within Exodus as a whole. And so we can miss it sometimes because, we just see hardened in English. But in Hebrew in the Bible, it's a little more clear. So let me give you an example. One of these words, the first word, the one that's the most dominant in the narrative, it's a word that actually can also mean like to seize or grab hold of. It's like a sense of hardening, like hardening your grip around it, right? And the very first time God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, just before that, something crazy has just happened. Just before that, it's Exodus 4, and God comes to Moses, and he's like, hey, I want you to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. And he goes, I'm going to give you a sign. And the sign is actually the first time this word gets used, right? And so in the sign, if I can say, so he's basically like, okay, Moses, take out your staff and drop it. And so Moses does that, falls to the ground, it turns into a snake, and the snake chases Moses. Moses is like running from the snake, and then God's like, no, go over and seize the snake by the tail, harden your grip around it, grab hold of it, and lift up the snake, and then it hardens into a staff, right? A sign of power and authority, right? And this is the first time this word gets used. It's right after this, God says, I'm going to harden Pharaoh, the snake's heart. And this image is, I believe it's foreshadowing, it's setting the stage of everything that's about to unfold, right? That Pharaoh is like the serpent. Pharaoh and Egypt are the serpent chasing God's people, represented by Moses, right? Like God's people are being oppressed, hunted down, chased by the serpent's power and Pharaoh. And Pharaoh hardens his heart against God and chases God's people like a serpent. And God is going to come in and God's going to grab Pharaoh by the tail. He's going to grab the empire of Egypt by the tail. He's going to lift it up and he's going to harden his grip around it to turn it back into a signpost of his power and authority in the world. And so when you see some like allusions like that, I think you see that there's more going on. Like in that narrative, God's not going like, ice finger to the heart, like I'm going to harden against. God's going, you've hardened yourself and are chasing my people, and so I'm going to harden my grip around you. And it's the same kind of image where later he goes, Pharaoh, I will raise you up to display my glory through you. He's going, I'm going to raise up the snake that's been,
And it's it's no accident. It's a serpent, right? The seed of the serpent in the beginning of Exodus has now become, or the beginning of Genesis has become this whole civilization, right?
Yep. The serpent in the Garden of Eden
is now the serpent in Egypt.
Egypt
right?
is the culmination of the serpent's power. His deception, his lie, his oppression, his justice. Like the enemy's work in the world is at work through Pharaoh and the empire that he heads. And God's about to deal with. He's about to crush the serpent under his foot. He's about to hold up the serpent and deal with its oppressive power.
Right.
And it's characterized by oppression, and God is about to display his glory by revealing himself as a liberator.
Isn't that interesting too? Because when the reason that we're given that God hardens Pharaoh's heart is not so that he'll let Israel go. It's for my glory, which sort of sounds weird because you're like, how is hardening someone's heart for your glory? It's like, I'm going to tie his hands behind his back and then fight him, and I'm going to look really good. Like, it's sort of like that's
that's interesting.
Like,
Yeah.
what's his glory?
Yeah.
Dude, that's a great, because that's actually one of the second most commonly used word. So the second word, kabod, it actually means glory or hard or heavy or weighty, and it's the same word, same idea. And so the idea is Pharaoh hardening his heart. When it talks about that, like this sense of like Pharaoh wants to glorify himself. He wants to make himself weighty, glorious, heavy, right? Hardened, like hard, like heavy. And it's this picture Pharaoh wants to become like God, right? Pharaoh
Because the
wants
word
to
kabod
displace God,
is used for
himself.
God a lot of other times in Exodus,
Totally.
right?
So I think God's going, the picture is kind of going like, you've sought to glorify yourself, and I'm going to glorify myself. But you've sought to glorify yourself by ordering the world around you, and it's unleashed destruction. I'm about to confront that. I'm going to
Who's the real
harden
God
and
here?
glorify
Right.
you.
Who's
Who's the real God here?
Right.
Which
So there's a
goes-
strong illusion there, like, I'll confront your self-glorification with my glory that actually liberates the world.
Because it's never good when humans try to become God, right? It just doesn't work.
Back to the first serpent.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Really quick, one last thing on that same word too. The first place it shows up in Exodus is when Pharaoh tells the Israelites, he's like, make their work harder. He goes, no, now you got to make just as many bricks as ever, but without straw. And it says this is the tipping point where Israel, it became too heavy, hardened. The labor was too hard. They were burdened under the weight of Pharaoh's labor. So I also think there's this picture with the word where God's going, you made life hard for my people. I'm about to make life hard for you.
Right.
You hardened my people Israel under your heavy forced labor. I'm about to harden you under my labor. Now you're going to do my work. You made them do your work. Now you're about to do mine and be an agent in
So
mine.
there's a lot of literary wordplay going on here that we're just not catching without reading our Hebrew Bibles.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, what I was going to say that for me feels so incredibly hopeful about that reading of the text and that understanding of the story is our mutual friend Tim Mackey says this. He says about this story that it is a picture of God taking the evil of Pharaoh in Egypt and turning it on itself, right? And I just thought of this while you were telling the story. When I was in 8th grade, I was a scrawny little 8th grader, and I was at the bus stop one day after school, and there was this big, giant, he must have flunked 8th grade like 7 times because he was huge.
He's 24 years
Kind of
old.
had a beard.
Yeah, he's gonna
This
go.
kid named Sabian, who was really a bully at school, and for some reason really wanted to just pummel me. And I was standing with my friend Brian, and Brian was also a scrawny kid like me.
Yeah.
And long story short, this kid Sabian, who was giant, and I'm so scared because I just feel like, okay, I'm just going to get the crap beaten out of me. He starts rushing at me. I remember he was like yelling at me. He starts rushing at me. I froze. I don't know what to do. And my friend Brian, who's scrawny like me, steps in front of me. And I'm like, what is happening? It was slow motion. And this kid Sabian's rushing at him, just rushing as hard as he can. He's just going to punch me in the face. And my friend Brian somehow, as he's rushing toward him, like gets slightly out of the way, grabs him, and just kind of pushes him. And his own momentum, like, throws him on the ground. And he like is all beat up and cut up and scraped up. And what's funny to me is, it's just that's what I thought of when you were saying all of this stuff, right? That God is going to take his hardening and God is going to now harden. It's like it is not, again, we keep coming back to this point. It's not God with his cold, icy finger just in and of himself doing this work. It is God participating in human choices and saying, if that is the choice you are going to make, I will leverage the choice you are making
To thwart you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn your evil in on itself. The evil, oppressive, unjust momentum you are building toward my people, I will use that very thing to topple you, to free my people, right? And to me, the reason that is so beautiful in some ways is when we read the story, because I know like some of us listening, when we think about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, and you were saying like sometimes we sympathize or empathize with Pharaoh, but when we do, it's actually mostly like an intellectual exercise. When we really think about our lives, the reality is we have much more in common. We certainly have things in common with Pharaoh. We make evil choices. But there is a lot in common with the people of Israel. There's a lot in life that feels overwhelming, like the systems of oppression and injustice in our personal lives and in the world feel like, man, I'm just getting the life choked out of me. And we have a God who is not far off, but a God who enters that story, participates in the story in such a way that someday he's going to take that evil and use its very momentum to topple it, to free his people, right?
Well, and I think when we talk about how we read our Bible, we can't pluck these stories out of as snapshots, or they won't make sense. We also can't over-personalize ourselves into the story, right? Like, this is not fundamentally a story about us. Yeah. And even if we say this is a story about God and who he is and the way that he rescues his people, I think that one of the things that bothers us, or can bother me about this story, is that the way that I talk about the God, the way that I understand God, is this God of second chances, this God of redemption, this God of forgiveness. And anytime I get a hint of God's judgment, I immediately personalize that and feel like God is going to judge me. And if we look throughout the Old Testament, God's judgment is always a good thing. It's like something people are crying out for, something that they're celebrating. And there's this like broken part of me that feels like I'm always sitting under his judgment, when really God is judging the evil around us in a way that is liberating and beautiful for us.
Right. Brings freedom, brings life, all those things.
Totally.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, like God's purposes are restoration, setting things right.
Yeah.
So I guess the final question going out of here is pastorally, how do we look at this as followers of Jesus? What does the story have to say to us? What are the pastoral implications of what this reveals about God and his people?
Man, well, I think I walk away going, God, soften my heart. You know, like for us, just going like, man, God, I want to soften my heart towards you. And God, would you, Holy Spirit, would you soften my heart towards you as well? You know, it's a participatory both end. It's me and God. Like I want to soften my heart. I want God to soften my heart. And I think that reality, the image of the heart, what is the heart? You know, the heart in Scripture, it's this image of like the seat of our desires, our affections, what we most love, what we most value. And I think our hearts were made to be like a sponge, not like a brick, right? So like with God going, dude, our hearts, what we most love, value, desire is made to be participating in the very presence of God, is to be saturated in the Spirit of God, right? And so, there's this piece of it going, Jesus, I want you to be everything, like what I love, what I value, what I'm living for. Jesus, let that be you. Let my heart be like a sponge that just soaks in your goodness and your presence. And,
What does that look like? I mean, I feel like soften my heart is kind of it's like a thing Christians say, like, and then we just walk out of here and we're like, yeah, I'm going to be soft. And then our life just kind of goes on, right? Like sponge. Actually, oh my gosh, I think I actually have like from youth group, a sponge.
There we go.
That like we were given at some point. It's been thrown away for a really long time now. But like, what does that look like?
Well, you know, when you're saying that, Josh, and then you're asking that question, Liz, it echoes, I think most of us have read that book, You Are What You Love, by Jamie Smith. And he's got this fantastic line in the book where he says, all human beings live leaning forward. There's no choice in the matter. Like every single one of us are leaning in a particular direction.
Towards something or something.
Towards something or someone, right? And to me, I think at least a part of softening our hearts are living with an awareness of the direction in which we are leaning. And that's every decision we make. It's the way we interact with ourselves and the world, certainly the way we interact with God and his people, the church. And so I think that's maybe one practical way, you know, maybe that's a question we can ask, like, what is the direction that I am leaning in? And then it really comes out to practical things. Like if we say we are leaning in the direction of Jesus and his redemptive plan for my life and the world, how does my life, my time, my resources, my energy, my thoughts, all of that, how does that reflect that sort of leaning posture? And I think the more we lean in that direction, the more our hearts soften toward the things of God and harden toward the things they should be hard toward. You know?
Totally. And I think another angle on it too is to sometimes it's easiest to see what it is by seeing what it's not, you know? And so contrasting with Pharaoh and going, God, I don't want to be like Pharaoh. And so are there ways that I've sought to be my own God, to kind of exalt myself, to glorify myself and order my world around myself rather than
Make my own
world
kingdom.
around you.
Yeah.
Yeah, like God, Jesus, I want you to be king. You get to call the shots in my life. Are there areas of disobedience? Are there areas where I'm trying to rule my own life, live my own life? I also think the question of, God, how am I treating people? You know, how am I using the authority, the power, the influence as a father, as a member of my neighborhood community? You know, how am I using that? Am I treating people like widgets that I'm using for my own self-glorification project, you know?
Right.
Or am I treating them like your children, using what you've given me to lift them up and to serve them? And so I think some of those contrasts, if Pharaoh's heart is the brick, I think the sponge, the soft heart is one that's driven by a love of God and others.
Right.
And our neighbors.
Yeah.
One
There
another
it is.
and our neighbor.
The three
Love
loves.
God, love your neighbor.
Love one another.
Well, I want to thank Jay and Liz and Joshua Ryan Butler, and thank you for joining us. And again, we could probably talk for 4 or 5 more hours on this stuff, but we hope this has been helpful. A difficult question, but hopefully, as we come away, that you'll have a soft heart and you'll see that our choices matter and that God's good. So we'll see you next week.